delighted to be able to moderate this panel again. My name is Mark Foster. I'm from the Crypto Council for Innovation. And as Tommaso said, yesterday we focused on what's happening now. This panel is more forward-looking, do a bit of crystal ball gazing in terms of some of the trends in the market, but also regulatory challenges going forward. So just in terms of a bit of housekeeping, what I'll do is I'm going to pass the floor to each of the participants for a kind of short intervention, and then we'll go to a Q&A. So I have a few questions planned and prepared, but I would really like some audience participation in this one. So a heads up already for those of you online, but also in the room, that I'll come to you for some thoughts in due course. So let's get on with it, because we already had the introductions there from Tommaso. So I'll start with Olivier. Would you like to just give your perspective in terms of some of the work that you're doing at the BIS Innovation Hub and some of the trends that you're seeing, and how that plays into the current and future regulatory agenda? Thank you, Olivier. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, and thanks for inviting me to this panel. So I think that the question is tough. So it's about global regulatory collaboration. It's forward-looking. So it's about collaboration. It's about regulation, and it's about the future. So I'm trying to disentangle this question a little bit and to give you kind of a perspective on kind of where I'm coming from. So when it comes to collaboration at the global scale, I think as a member of the BIS, I'm very well positioned to talk about that, and I will give you a flavor of like how we approach that in the projects we're doing. On the regulation, with my background, I'm not the best to talk about that, so it's not my comparative advantage. But still, let me try and give you some perspective on that, and then we're coming to the question about what's next. So I think before we delve into these questions, we should really understand, or try to understand, where we stand at the current stage. So let me start with kind of the disentangling and the global collaboration part. So my background, I'm a member of the BIS Innovation Hub. I'm part of the Swiss Center. So there is a couple of centers spread across the globe. I'm part of the Swiss Center, and we are doing various projects in various fields. We are very broadly, we're looking into topics related to central bank innovation. So more concretely, it's about how central banking of the future might look like. And the topics are broad, as I said. But one of the aspects that we look into are central bank digital currency, so CBDCs, and more broadly tokenization and DeFi. So we're looking into the benefits and challenges of new emerging technological opportunities, and we ask questions. So what is the best response of a central bank? So we approach this very practically. So we do proofs of concept, we do prototypes, and we try to address these questions very practically when it comes to these new technological opportunities. So addressing the questions that are at the heart of central banking. So policy questions, operational questions, and obviously, I mean, in this kind of work that we are doing, collaboration is a key aspect. So we need collaboration between the central banks. But equally important, we also need these public-private collaborations. So just as an example, we're currently working on Project Mariana, and this goes into the space of DeFi. So we are exploring DeFi ideas and concepts, and ask the question whether we could use these concepts to do cross-currency trading using CBDCs. So then we look into questions like, okay, so how could a central bank actually implement the CBDC on a smart contract? How would the CBDC transfers across different blockchain networks work? Could we actually use these decentralized exchanges, or AMMs, to do these trading and settlement? So we are very close to kind of the current edge of technological developments, and then we try to answer questions that are at the heart of central banking, as I said before. So it comes to central bank policy questions. So that's how I see collaboration. So it's really about learning, iteratively learning on how we should think about the central bank of the future. And as you might guess, so now regulation is not, at this stage of the development, is not really the key part of our investigation. So it's really more about feasibility and about these operational aspects. But I think as we move closer to anything that is implementable in a future, then I think it's natural to think about these regulatory questions as well. So I think, so where do we stand? We are still at the very early stage of development. So from a central bank perspective, at least, that's my perspective. But we are learning, we are iterating on the things we have learned so far. We are collaborating with the private sector, and I think this is how the journey needs to continue.
Thanks very much, Oliver. That's a good reminder, because obviously being in Brussels, we always think of regulation first, and it's great to see that yourselves and others are thinking about, you know, the feasibility, doing the planning, the preparation stage, so we get this right, rather than going necessarily straight to regulation and then having to review or unwind things. Maha, maybe can turn to you. You're the Director of Compliance and Regulatory Affairs at Bankhaus, but I understand you will be going to another role relatively soon at the Qatari Financial Centre Authority, heading up their regulatory affairs issue. So perhaps you can have a dual-hatted role here in terms of your introductory comments, your current role, but also looking perhaps from a future regulator's perspective. What do you see as some of the trends and some of the issues in terms of the collaboration between private sector but also public sector in terms of regulators?
First of all, thank you so much for having me, and apologies for not being able to be there in person. I'm having a bit of envy for those who are on the floor, but hopefully next year I'll be there in person. So just as a quick background, I started my career working for a regulator, then moved to a financial infrastructure provider as Deutsche Börse, then moved to a fintech scale-up. And after that, I'm currently working for an OTC trader market maker. And as of next month, I'll be heading regulatory affairs for Qatar Financial Center. So across these multiple roles, I started looking into crypto assets and DLT and DeFi into different perspectives. And I think that made me question facts and fiction and look at it from a skeptical point of view. And frankly speaking, I see a huge potential for the use of DeFi and crypto assets across these different industries. In terms of collaboration, we see that, as usual, everything is dictated on an international standard setting body, be it BIS, IOSCO, OECD, etc., and G20. One aspect that I think we should not lose sight of is the new evolving multipolar nature of dynamics that we're looking at the moment. We've got G20, and soon we're going to have some impact from BRICS, which is something that should not be underestimated when we're seeing two different powers competing to different principles, etc. So what I see is different kinds of collaborations. Of course, there's public-private partnerships, but there will be a lot of public-public partnerships, in addition to different kinds of collaborations that will go outside of the regulated governmental institutions, be it a collaboration on a technical level or an industry level, or some sorts of associations. One thing that I'm really scared about is once we're looking into setting these collaborative regulatory approaches, we tend to look at it primarily from a developed world point of view. So we're always assuming an effective market. We're assuming that a lot of people have access to financial means and services, but we tend to forget that by over-regulating and by kneecapping some of the regulatory developments, we should not foresee a future where we're still not serving the unbanked. If I'm not mistaken, the latest figures that I read were around, I don't know, 1.4 billion of unbanked individuals. 50% of the unbanked population is in the Middle East, which makes me look into these collaborations in a way to ensure that we have all the safeguards in place, but reaping the full potential that our technology, DLT, blockchain, and once it reaches a sufficient maturity, DeFi, is to offer. So I look into collaboration in different aspects, not only from a regulatory point of view, but industry and technology driven. And we need to make sure what made us reach that point at the beginning. Why are there certain inefficiencies in TradeFi that we're trying to mitigate with DeFi, and how can we build that bridge in a smooth way? Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Maha. That's a really interesting angle. I'm sure we'll come back to the idea about, developed world, developing or emerging economies, and how this all fits together in terms of trying to have consistency and coherence, which of course some of the bigger global actors on the private sector are always looking for. John, over to you. I know you've done a couple of sessions already, so people know you and your role. How do you see the collaboration that you've had so far? You mentioned earlier that obviously good contacts with the European stakeholders and the other perhaps more developed and sophisticated markets. What do you see in terms of your business around the trends and the areas that are coming down the track from a regulatory perspective, but also in terms of broader collaboration?
Thanks. Yeah, so I think I'm basically just going to pick up on both of what the two previous speakers said. So I think for sure that we mentioned it in the previous panel, that what you want at a certain point, if it's thoughtful and if it's well assessed, you want a clear framework. You want certainty as an innovator in this space. Peter mentioned this was what people in the industry was actually asking before the MiCA proposal actually came about. And this is, of course, what you as a DeFi service provider is also looking for now. You're looking to have that engagement, whether it's public-private through BIS, which is a great example. You had both the Project Guardian, which was MAS, BIS, and you have now Project Mariana, where they're looking specifically at using AMMs for remittances or for FX exchange. So these types of public-private pilots are definitely important, but as I think probably it was a conversation I had before, is that we've heard a lot for the past 7 years about all these pilots, and we haven't really seen it come into regulation. I mean, we all have big hopes. We all have also the DLT pilot regime in the EU, where we hope to gain this kind of evidence base that will drive forward some much clearer regulation and provides the supervisor or the regulator a chance to get in very early to see how the technology works in an entirely new field, and then try to take that slowly into bigger pieces of regulation instead of just saying, okay, DLT is here, we need to scrap MiFID or come up with a new one, which would be quite a bigger task than MiCA, but trying to get this sense of what is the actual risk, how does it work? Trying to educate both ways. So both the regulators need to understand the technologists needs to understand the regulatory perspectives. But I think one of the things that Maha touched upon is probably even more important from our perspective. And I've had the, I would say, benefit of experiences from both the European Commission side and now from the industry side, is that all these global standard setters and all the work that is being done to promote convergence, it's great. It's very much, as Maha says, from a developed world perspective, because, I mean, you have the very big countries sitting in FSB and the other groups, and they're very, very helpful in the sense that they give some kind of direction. But often I wonder whether if you take something like the FATF, where they've existed for quite a number of years, we have the recommendations, we still have a very, very different implementation of the FATF rules, both in terms of interpretation, but also about how effective they are. I mean, and they are probably some of the most effective, because the mutual evaluations of the FATF standards is very, very hard on countries, and they really want to live up to the recommendations. But the implementation still diverges. And this is, of course, on a small scale, but what I've seen in the EU is that, and this is to use a very used term, but this information sharing, whether good or bad, about projects coming out of your region or your country, really can promote just as much convergence as sitting in these international standard setting bodies. Just the fact of the regulator taking in an innovative product, going through a sandbox or going through whatever they have in that jurisdiction, and just publishing, just getting people to engage and talk to each other, regulator to regulator, like Maha says. So not so much private-public, but public-public. I think that's increasingly important, because they are not all part of the big standard setters. So I think just publishing, again, good and bad, because there will be a lot of failed experiences, or there will be a lot of, okay, here's a huge risk, we needed to shut this pilot down. But tell people about it, which is, of course, very difficult when you're also looking at global competitiveness, what you want to keep for yourself. But for us, it definitely helps a lot if this is something that becomes a habit of kind of sharing your losses and wins.
That's great, John. And just building on that point and the question that the points that Maha made, maybe over to John, to Oliver in terms of a reaction to that. I mean, to what extent does the international standard setting bodies, and appreciate that not every jurisdiction is in each body, and there's a kind of myriad of different ones out there, but you have very different roles in some sense, and you've developed, as John said, over a long time with a kind of traditional financial structure with entities, with ways of working. Is part of the role in terms of your work at the BIS in the Innovation Hub about bringing together other jurisdictions that are not naturally involved? How can you and how do you work with not only the members that are jurisdictions of the BIS, but also expand that out? And to what extent can maybe the private sector and others get involved to support your work? Is that something that's also part of your thinking when it comes to collaboration?
Yeah, so I mean, there is a couple of things to that question. So I think, I mean, the BIS is certainly very well positioned to act as this global body to facilitate this exchange and to generate agreement on standards. But the BIS itself doesn't then implement any of these standards. So that was always the case, and it will be in the future. That will be the responsibility of local jurisdictions. So it's an important body to generate this dialogue that is required to have agreement on like how to regulate these new activities, these new infrastructures, whatever. But it is not a body to set out these regulations, right? So how is our work feeding into this process? So I think and as I said before, we do very practical work, and I think this is very valuable as input to this, let's say, the global discourse on how to approach these new opportunities coming from blockchain and smart contracts and DeFi and whatever. And it is essential in this process to have this collaboration with the private sector, because so as the way I see us is we are kind of, you know, maybe some form of catalyst between the private sector and the broader discourse, because we ourselves, so the Innovation Hub, we don't do development ourselves. So we don't have the capacities in-house to build these projects. So there we heavily rely on the collaboration with the private sector, so with the experts, so with the crowd that builds these new software, these new infrastructures, and that is an essential part. And I think this is the way I see the Innovation Hub. So maybe a little bit as a catalyst in this global discourse towards kind of, and hopefully converging towards something that where these new technologies can thrive, right? So that's how I would put it.
Yeah, that's great to hear from our perspective in the private sector. We're really keen to have those dialogues, of course, at all levels. And Maha, maybe if I turn to you, you mentioned the idea about obviously looking at this through the prism of developed and sophisticated and established jurisdictions when it comes to financial markets, when it comes to crypto as well. Looking forward in terms of some of the challenges from a regulatory perspective, are there any things that you can identify in terms of lessons learned from the EU, perhaps in terms of MiCA, from some of the other jurisdictional work done in Japan, in Singapore? How does that feed into the thinking that you will be doing in your future role? But also, how can that support the work that the international standard setters are doing in terms of identifying those trends, those key issues, where the more we can think about working in a similar way, the stronger the chance of having comparability and convergence going forward?
I think this is a very relevant question. I have just read a paper by the European Parliament that looks into the diversions of crypto assets regulation. And Apologies, it just got a notification. So just reading the European Parliament's recent paper and looking into how the diversions and the conversions of regulating and overseeing something that is global in nature, you cannot really fit it in one box, because even from a supervisory point of view, you cannot really tame crypto assets or DeFi. It has a global nature in operation. So looking into what I have learned in the past 6 years working on digital assets and DLT related topics in Europe, basically Europe has set the tone into providing the necessary regulatory clarity, giving sufficient room to innovate, but also addressing the key risks. And I think this is something that a lot of jurisdictions were not fortunate enough to have, where some were choosing to enforce, others were taking extreme measures to ban. So looking from the lessons learned from Europe is provide regulatory clarity, give people innovation, the opportunity to innovate, be it in the DLT pilot regime or sandbox environments, but keep the dialogue going, because it's a two-way communication. Regulators can look into financial stability, but the industry can innovate and try to solve real-world problems. So in my future role, I'll be basically looking into MiCA as a blueprint. There are different things compared to the Middle East from Europe. Like, very politely put, in the Middle East, we do not really value privacy as much as we do in Europe. So our concerns around how our data is used is hardly something that a lot of Middle Eastern people will be thinking about, but they will be thinking, I can have instant payments, I can have access to very efficient, cost-efficient means to transmit, because don't forget, a lot of the Middle Eastern countries are very reliant on remittances to send money back home. So I would see that Europe has set the standard, the tone, and there will be a lot of tweakings that will have to be done on a national level to keep it like in a convergence point of view, because we need to collaborate in a supervisory point of view, because it's not like traditional finance that you will just stop a Swift code from being processed. It's beyond our control in a sense. So I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Maha. We've got some questions coming in online from virtual participants, so I'll move to those. But again, give people in the audience an opportunity to ask questions as well. Please raise your hand. Let me know if you have any questions. So the first question, and feel free for anyone to answer this. John, you did touch upon the DLT pilot project, though, so perhaps this is one that you might be well placed to do. The question is, why is there so little talk about the pilot project at conferences like this, even though that would be a perfect topic for collaboration? So can you build out a little bit on terms of what the EU's done? We talked about sandboxes yesterday as well. How do you see that fitting into the regime in terms of developing future regulation?
No, I think it's it's a fair question. I do try to bring it up certain times. I think like the very easy answer would be that the DLT pilot regime, of course, is not a sandbox in the traditional sense. It is, as a matter of fact, the first time you have a legal instrument in Europe to exempt from specific rules. What that also means is that you need to get authorized as either a CSD or an MTF to actually access it, which a lot of smaller crypto innovators are not really prepared to do. It requires you to be a relatively substantial size for an entity. So I think an easier way to look at it would be that an innovator in blockchain or crypto space, perhaps even ourselves, a way that we could participate in a project like this would be to do it together with someone, a financial institution, that maybe already has that authorization. That would be a way to collaborate. But I think also important here is that unlike a traditional sandbox, when you go in, you don't know whether a product is regulated or not, which is the kind of the initial idea from the FCA sandbox that we then pretty much copy-pasted throughout Europe, or at least some jurisdictions or some member states more than others. There you have an untested product. You're not really sure whether it fits or not within the regulatory perimeter. So the idea is that the innovators come in, they get to test on a certain size, so within a certain volume, and they have the supervisor basically sitting on their lap for a couple of months, which is this very close collaboration where you get something like I mentioned before. Both the innovators learn about regulation, the regulators learn about the technology, where the DLT pilot regime is more, as I said, a legal instrument. So you could often have the incumbents that choose to try to test it do it without the supervisors. They are basically just set in level 1 and some level 2, like these are the rules, and you get on with it. So it doesn't necessarily come with additional supervision or additional engagement. That might happen if you combine the two aspects. So you have both the legal instrument, you have some flexibility that you would need to use from the traditional sandbox sense of the word. So yeah, I mean, that's my best bet as to why it doesn't come up that much in these conferences. But I still hope that people will take advantage of it. And I hope that there will be, as I said, collaborations on the private side, because it's going to be very tricky for a smaller innovator to get in. But they could do that in collaboration with someone who's willing to test out a product, a financial institution, a bank, that say, okay, we don't have the smart contract capabilities or the developer capabilities, but we want to use these as a software provider. Kind of like when the BIS say, okay, we don't have that internally, so we come up with a pilot with the ideas, but we outsource it through a tender or whatever to private entities to come and test it. The bank could kind of do the same. Yeah,
I think that's interesting. I remember when the DLT pilot project was being developed, there was a bit of a sense that it was very well intentioned, but a very European focus, and therefore, you know, the way the scope works sometimes that it disincentivizes a bit of that kind of global collaboration when you have both smaller players and players from other jurisdictions. I don't know whether Maha or Oliver want to comment on that. I've got a couple more questions coming in, so if there are no additional thoughts on the pilot project. Thanks, Glenn Wright, for the questions, which are a bit more of an investor focus. So I'll take them together. Can the global regulatory collaboration instill greater confidence in investors eyeing cross-border crypto ventures? And then a second part of the similar question, still about investors, how can policymakers keep investors interested while standardizing global crypto rules? So I had a question myself earlier as well, in terms of there's a lot of things going on now in Europe and elsewhere. We're trying to make sure that there's convergence around the current regime, at the same time as thinking about the future regime. But this is an angle from an investor's perspective. And obviously, you know, if the investors aren't there in terms of these projects, there's less of an interest in them being built, and the whole ecosystem won't develop as much. So maybe Maha, with your kind of current hat on, that might be one that you might like to reflect on, and then happy to open up to John and Oliver as well.
Whoever asked that question, well done, because this is one of my biggest pain points. I mean, when we're trying to comply with regulatory regimes, be it MiCA or the local one, the national ones, oftentimes you will always find the disclaimer that while we have to go through authorization processes, ensuring prudential requirements, mostly, if not always, you'll always find this term that whatever we have will exclude investor protection. So it's exclude investor and deposit insurance schemes. So in a lot of cases, investors would not have the same amount of protection that they would have in TradeFi. What a lot of industry players are doing is try to mitigate that risk by having insurance policies in place, so indemnity insurance that could cover for part of the losses. But I find it completely unfortunate that MiCA would exclude investor protection and deposit guarantees, even though crypto asset service providers would have to still comply with the full suite of regulation, including prudential requirements under CRR and CRD. I think that this is slightly unfair, but what the industry is trying to do to resolve it is come up with their own segregation of accounts, insurance policies in place to keep that incentive going. But I'm hoping that the revision of MiCA would look into that a bit closer and try to mitigate it. Also in the Middle East, basically whatever you invest in these products or services, you would have to have the willingness to lose it, which makes it very, very unattractive for non-sophisticated or professional investors.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. I'm reading it differently, as in how would an investor who wants to invest in, for example, Uniswap Labs, how would they benefit from greater collaboration? Which might, at least if that is the question, I would answer that I think, well, MiCA is definitely, we've seen that, which we of course hope come to fruition, but we have seen several inflows in terms of investments in crypto firms providing services that will eventually be global. But of course that is a good place to start. But as what was his name? Sorry, Glenn, as Glenn asked, you are dependent on any other jurisdiction accepting the MiCA framework, because there is no reciprocity. There was not another framework to make mutual recognition against. So MiCA doesn't really have that. So you're depending on people to emulate either MiCA or through the international standards, come up with something which is similar enough that you can expect to get authorized and not only provide to EU27, but even abroad. So I think the two are heavily correlated, that it will create greater investments generally. And especially this is important for also where Maha is going, where if you have a home market that is not big enough, you need to either prove that you are coming up with some flexible and still solid regulation that can be exported, or unfortunately you need to follow some of the bigger jurisdictions and what they have done. Well, we often talk about first mover advantage, and some jurisdictions talking about second mover advantage by learning from others. But clearly, where there can be this collaboration and learning from each other, it's going to be helpful moving forward. Oliver, maybe just move over to you. We touched upon earlier there the idea between a bit of a trade-off between the work that we have to do now in the public sector, in international standard-setting bodies, but also in the private sector, in terms of compliance and implementing the rules at jurisdictional level. Now, I appreciate that's not your role, but how do you see that trade-off and that balance between that piece of work and then the forward-looking thinking in terms of what are the next challenges? How do we make sure we're in a good place to be able to be thinking about regulation further down the track and have had that kind of collaboration and the feasibility studies that you mentioned? Obviously, everyone's always resource constrained on the private sector as well as the public sector. But how do you think about these kind of things from a public sector perspective?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and the short answer is I don't have the answer to that, I think. But maybe to a little bit more broadly. So of course the sector is evolving, and maybe back to the previous question, maybe not answering this question, but rather the last question. So taking a bigger picture perspective. So that was a very specific question on kind of an investor perspective, but the more broader question is how do we disincentivize the growth of this sector, or incentivize or disincentivize, right? And I think one of the key aspects, and we really need to go back to the roots and let's say, okay, where are the actual business opportunities? Where are the use cases? What problem are we trying to solve? What risks in the current sector do we try to address? So I think these are the basic questions that we need to address. And once we have a clear picture of what we are supposed to do, I think it's kind of this. There will be a natural evolution of next steps, and then I think these questions around how do we deal with regulation and how do we still kind of make sure that we can move forward. I think this also needs to be seen in this context, right? So we need to have this clear vision of where do we want to go, what problem are we trying to solve, and then I think it's it's not self-fulfilling, but at least the path is clearer. But as I said, I'm not answering your question, I guess.
No. That's a great point, because it does speak to the question around investors and the use cases and the end users. That's ultimately where these projects and these companies and this ecosystem is going to live or die. But by that, I'm conscious we're coming to time and respectful of the other panels that are stopping us from getting some lunch at some point. So, are there any questions? A final question from anyone in the audience? If not, I'll very quickly maybe ask for one final question to all three of you. Is there a missing element in terms of what we're doing now that we should be doing moving forward? Is what would be the one thing, if there's one thing that you think we should be looking at and focusing more in terms of preparing the next phase of regulation? I'll maybe start with John. We'll go the other way around. John first, Maya, and then final word for Oliver.
Is there one thing missing? I kind of feel like all the building blocks are there. I mean, they just need to kind of come together. I mean, you have these sandboxes, you have the global coordination by the big standard setters. I think still to Maha's point, I think this now that you see moving from FSB to IMF to also make it broader about not just developed economies, I think that's super important, because as we also see with, for example, DeFi, is that a lot of the use cases, a lot of the difficulty you will have sometimes in explaining crypto or blockchain to your friends, and at least in Denmark with the well-functioning payment system, is just a much different use case when you're in an undeveloped economy. And I think bringing them to the table, making sure that the global coordination is not just 10 big countries, but it's broadened out. I think that's important. But I think basically the building blocks are there. People just need to kind of pull it together.
Further decentralize the collaboration.
Yeah.
Very good. Maha, final thought from you?
I think I am in alignment with everything that has been said so far, which makes it a bit less controversial. However, the point that I would like to make is that we have seen certain things working and certain things not working. So sometimes, putting pride aside, we should take some corrective actions from be it a national or international standard setting bodies to say, this did not work. We can already make a consultation phase and try to mitigate that as soon as possible. So while the key pillars are there, what is necessary is taking quick corrective actions so that we do not lose pace in achieving the overall goal of financial inclusion, market stability, and increasing innovation.
Excellent, thank you. And Oliver, is there one thing that would help us make your life easier? What can we do on the private sector side to further improve collaboration?
Make my life easier. Good question. So I want to pick up on the point that it's hard to explain this to your friends, right? What we are actually doing or what's happening, and why this could be beneficial. I would go like one step further, and maybe I would say it's even hard to explain that to the experts. So when talking to bankers and experts in financial market infrastructures, like this may be a game changer, right? So these decentralized infrastructures may be game changers, and they may have lots of implications that we need to think about. And I also kind of in these conversations, I also feel a lot of reservation against, like, okay, so that might questions like, okay, so that might affect my business model fundamentally, and like, okay, so why should I actually start engaging there? If the risks and the unanswered questions are so huge, right? So I think we need to really kind of continue the way we have done so far. We need to explore the pros and cons, and I think what we haven't done enough is kind of try and be even more inclusive, and try to engage with the actors that are currently affected in these markets, or that would be affected by the change of the new technologies, onboard them and show them how this could actually work in the future. And I think I think the BIS Innovation Hub is doing a great job there, but I think we need to do that even more. We need to be more inclusive in kind of the way we do experimentation and the way we analyze these new opportunities.
Excellent. That's a great way to finish a call for action on more inclusiveness and more collaboration. It just leaves me to say thank you very much to John, to Maha, and to Oliver, and then thank you. Please show your appreciation.
Thank you so much.
Mark.